Welcome to today's Destination Unknown. I'm your host, Alyssa Hall. Today, I wanted to take a moment to really give the spotlight to an artist whose work we've been talking about and will continue to talk about, not just on this podcast, but so many people around the world. And that's Pamela Coleman Smith. So we've been looking at the Rider-Waite Smith deck when doing a lot of our studies here on the channel. And it's specifically the illustrator, Pamela Coleman Smith, who is the last part of that moniker. And that didn't used to be the case. The deck itself was initially called the Rider, and then it began to be known as the Rider-Waite, and then it became even later known as the Rider-Waite Smith, as a way to include Pamela in recognition of her work in creating that deck. So today what I've done is I've made some notes, and I wanted to read from those notes what I've compiled them from, and we'll be playing a little show and tell. This particular book here by K. Frank Jensen, The Story of the Waite Smith Tarot. It's got a stylized picture of Pamela Coleman Smith and Arthur Waite on the cover. And that particular picture is kind of the one that most of us have seen as far as Pamela. And there's one more picture I can show of you for now, or show of her to you, right here. That's another picture of Pamela Coleman Smith. So I'm going to dive into some of the notes that I've made. Those are coming from this source, which I found to be a great and reputable source when it comes to really finding out about a person who was unknown to a lot of tarot history until more recent time. So let's dive deep into Pamela Coleman Smith, her life, and the legacy that she's left behind. Mostly what I've done is try to compile some interesting personal facts about her so that you get a feel for who she was as a person, as well as the work that we'll be studying nonstop until the day we die, I'm sure, as tarot historians. Pamela Coleman Smith was baptized as Corrine Pamela Coleman Smith, and she was sometimes called Pam or later Pixie by her friends. She was born on February 16th, 1878 in London, and she was born to some well-established American parents who were from Boston. It was her father's work that kept the family traveling for many of the years that she grew up. And she spent her earliest years in England, but also traveled regularly to Kingston, Jamaica, and to New York City with her father for his work. Pamela says that it was specifically her Black nanny that she had when she was in Jamaica who greatly influenced her by telling her a lot of the native stories and legends. And later we'll see this influence in Pamela's life, very specifically with the Anansi stories that she tells and illustrates for later. Now, Pamela's mother died when she was 18 years old. And there is some speculation about her parentage. So Pamela herself was described many different ways. When people tried to classify her ethnicity, they were often baffled, and they would use words such as Oriental, Black, or Japanese as some ways to describe Pamela. But we don't know entirely that her parentage was her parents that we have as the American born. It may be, as according to K. Frank Jensen's work, that she was a child of perhaps one of her father's other mistresses, women, someone on the side who was recognized and brought up by the family. This is a speculation. Like we said, her mother died when she was 18, and this basically became a catalyst, as anyone would. Now, when she was 15, she began to attend the art school called the Pratt Institute, and that was in England. And that was where she had a real solid foundation for years, where she studied all forms of what we call now commercial art. So she learned not only about the fine arts aspect of drawing and painting, she also learned a lot about how the illustrations would look given the modern coloring aspects, in which case there was often, because of the wood blocks that were used in times past, there was a coloring aspect where they would layer colors, but only very simply, like yellow, blue, red, those primaries, maybe green. And those would be really all you had to look to see a color palette from. And you'll see that in several of the earliest decks where they tried different forms of coloring Pamela's works when they were mass producing the deck later. But let's jump back in here. So she was 15 years old when she started studying art more formally. She did this for 3 years solid until her mother's death, where she went back to Jamaica to attend the funeral. And it was about then that we see some evidence that she began to sign her letters as Con, C-O-N, short for Constance. No one's quite sure where this came from. But the actress Ellen Terry in New York in 1897 is reputably the one who gave her the nickname Pixie, which she began signing instead at that point in her life. So in 1897, that was when she was living with her father. So she's age 19, and she began to earn her money, to begin to earn her own income by sewing off hand-colored books, illustrations. She did a lot of painting work. This was where she really began what we would call today a life as a commercial artist, and began her portfolio. She also, at this age 19, about this time, was when she first built a miniature theater and began to write plays and design stage settings for her miniature theater. Now, this comes into play again when her theater background gets expanded upon. But for now, it was in 1899, a few years later, when she was 21 years old, that her father died. So here she is. She is now 21, and she can live anywhere in the world because she has no family ties per se. She chose not to live in America. She is reputed, again, from K. Frank Jensen's work, to not really taking to life in the United States. There's a bit of a quote. I didn't mark it, but I wonder if I can find it. Here it is, right here in 1904. This would have been 2 years before she formally began the Tarot Project, mind you. So about 5 years after she had lost her father. She wrote, "What a people from America I've seen seem to be very much of stick in the mud, hampered, weighted down, dull, narrow, without feeling sort of people. And those that have feeling are so dull, so empty." Those have exclamation points after them. "They seem to suck in all you give 'em and give nothing back. Why can't people be simple? They're also affected and empty." So she wasn't very, having grown up in so many different cultures and also being a person whose ethnicity and heritage was probably also something that was constantly being discussed, she did not enjoy life in America or the American culture. And so we see that she went back to England and she joined Ellen Terry at the Lyceum Theatre Company. This is where that background that she began to have as younger when she was doing the stage settings really pays off, because she began working on not just in their costumes and with some costume work there, she also began designing a lot of their scenery there. And she lived for her first year. Before she had her own apartment, she had lived with Ellen Terry. And this is where she also began to meet, it was through this job that she first met William Butler Yeats. Now that's going to be very significant, even though I think the two she didn't really like him that much, is what is described in Jensen's work. But they later had quite a working relationship together as she began to do stage setting work for some of his plays. And then he was so influential because he was the gateway to her introduction into the Golden Dawn. The Golden Dawn was an esoteric, or what we might call today an occult studies, secret society that was going on in Victorian England. And these members, so let's backtrack here onto my notes. She began a weekly salon about this time as well. And in fact, she kept from 1901 to 1905, she kept a guest book. So by this point, she's aged, that would be age 23 to 26, roughly, in her life. And the guest book is reputed to have over 150 pages of signatures and little anecdotes from people over the years, including several prominent Golden Dawn members, both men and women. So we go back, let me circle back because I'm jumping around here in my notes. It was her salon that was an open house, and it was meant to welcome in artists and authors and actors, people who were expansive thinkers, is what I would say now here on Destination Unknown. And in fact, the parlor that I've held a few times for the channel is literally inspired most directly from the history and legacy of Pixie. I just think it's adorable. I wish we had these artist salon culture things, but it's a difficult thing in today's time. So these artists and authors, etc., they would come, they would read their works, they would be presenting some of their ideas to other free thinkers, expansive thinkers, and they were all entertained by Pamela's fairy tales and her miniature theater plays. So here's where we begin to see a lot of her storytelling aspects circle back more in her adult life. And you see a lot of references, so many subtle references to how she chose to illustrate the entire 78 cards, takes a lot of inspiration from all of the stories and the very strong educational background she had as a young woman. It's specifically the Jamaican Anansi tales that were a favorite at the salons. And you will see she did some illustration for an Anansi. Let me see if I can find that one for a good show and tell real quick. Again, all these little moments that I'm finding are just in a dedicated portion where they talk about all of their collaboration together. That one right there, that's the Anansi. See that? By Pamela Coleman Smith. So we're not going to spend all of this time talking about how she and Wade hooked up, not literally, hooked up, talked about this work, and they began to collaborate. We know that they did begin that collaboration about 1906, so she would have been about 28, is that right? 27, 28. And so that was about the time that they began to collaborate, and she began to create what we now have as the 78 works that they became. And it was published in 1909. So that's when we know she was finished with the project. And by this point, things in life were changing for her. So before I do that, let's go back. So it was, oh, and by the way, when it comes to her salons, we're going to talk about this here, but I'm going to jump ahead in her life and salons specifically to say that it was in 1914 when she was about the age of 38. And it's thought that this is connected to World War I. She closed down her salons, and she seemed to have a very marked change in how she began to deal with other people. I think she became what we would now say much more of a hermit. She preferred solitude, or she had time. We'll get to the rest of her history there. But very specifically, she closed down her salons, and she no longer wanted, she seemed, I believe there's a quote in the book as well, where she kind of expresses this tiresome view where she once had such an eagerness to expand and want to take in the world war. The first war had really changed that, is what is believed here in this book itself. So we know she shared a home for years with Nora Lake. But there's no evidence in particular that they had anything more substantial as a relationship. Now, Nora was married and had a daughter. In fact, that's the daughter that when the second picture, the one where we see the profile, she's looking at Nora's daughter. And in fact, we know that they continued to have a relationship because by the end of her life, Pamela was once again living with Nora, and she ended up leaving all of her estate to Nora Lake. exclusively. So we know that their relationship was extremely close, but there's a lot of conjecture about her life and we don't know. And so it's not fair to jump to conclusions. And it's very specifically not our business is often the way I approach it. Certainly we know that she was surrounded in theater by a lot of people. It's mentioned in the book as well. Many of the associates that we have in her salons and such, we know that they were people who were of the gay and lesbian community, but we don't know what her own inclination was. Nothing of that really seems left behind. So in the interest of not speculating in her personal life, we'll leave that as it is. Now, when it comes to speculating about her personal life, Stuart Kaplan, who is the US Games, who ended up publishing and therefore capitalizing the most on Pamela's legacy of work, later he wrote in the Encyclopedia of Tarot that Pamela was a pretty unhappy figure. He painted her as a failed artist, and he has quite a long quote that's also in the book here that comes from the Encyclopedia of Tarot, that where it talks about how her works probably would have been forgotten. She was an obscure artist at her time. By 1920, we know that she herself felt her works had been outdated, and that by 1914, that was her last public exhibition. So it's hard to know how much his conjecture about being a failed artist is looking at the fact that really early on, she didn't pass away until 51. We'll get to that. But we see this huge gap of time where she was still creating. That's talked about in this biography. But she was no longer in the commercial aspect of it, and she certainly was in a different phase of her, the way she related with fellow humans. So, yes, Stuart Kaplan goes on about how if it weren't for the commission that she took with Arthur Waite, we might not even remember her. And like I mentioned, it was in 1906 that they began that collaboration, and about 3 years later that it was published. Yes, her last public exhibition was in 1914, and by 1920, calling her work outdated, of course, by this point, we would have seen a lot of the Art Nouveau as well as the Art Deco movements going through. Her work was very solidly grounded and inspired by some of the Japanese woodblock cuttings of her education and her youth. And I think that's what we see when she calls her work outdated. She identifies with the methods and her own methodology as no longer being what was being most popular and currently consumed in that time. So she inherited some money from her uncle when she was about 40 years old. So again, about that same age that she's about 38 when she kind of closes down the salons and everything. Here it is, about 40 years old. She inherits some money, and this allows her to buy a house. And she decides to do that in Cornwall. She's done with London life. She's done with people, and she's much more interested in living a different lifestyle. And it's here later that, oh, by the way, here's an aside. It's speculated that perhaps because she was inspired by Arthur Waite's devotion to Catholicism, that she decided to convert to it. That would have been in about 1911 is the date. So again, just before the Great War and all of these big changes. But we know that this particular shift in focusing on religion continues to inform her art from what is left behind of her legacy and what she chose to doodle and write with and express herself through. So while she was finished with the commercial aspect of art, there definitely was the artist that continued to come through. So she bought her house, it was in Park Garland, and it was there that she moved, Nora Lake moved in with her. By this point, Nora was a widow. She had lost her husband, and she moved in to live at that point for the rest of Pixie's life. Pamela was there until the day she died with Nora, and that was on September 18th, 1951, at the age of 73. So again, there was this gap from about 40 years old to 73 that we know she really began to shift in how she lived her life. So that is what we have. And like we said, everything in her estate was left behind to her great friend, Nora Lake, as she wrote. And that's the last that we know of her wishes when it came to that. I'm not sure that she would be pleased, surprised, happy, or delighted. Who knows what her emotion might be to know that what she's now known for best is those 78 cards, which are we continue to look at. Really, that background, that's the last thing I would say. Her ability to look at the background and the scenery and things, look at the background of these cards. I'm running out of time, so I better wrap this up. Thank you again for joining me here on Destination Unknown. And as always, keep listening.